I just remembered to make a little sheet to pass around using old media, if you happen to have a pen or a pencil. If you want to enter your name and email in particular, I'll be happy to send you a free ebook about this lecture, and maybe another one I may toss in as well. I'm going to give you a little bit of information about myself and what my company has done over the past few years, and then launch into a discussion that I hope will be of interest to you regarding science fiction user experience design. And to do that, I have to don my lecture hat so that I can welcome you as fellow Kions or Hakions or Uxers or Ixers, interaction design. It's the world of science fiction and computer-human interaction. We at AM+A, we've been busy for the past 33 years designing user interfaces, user experiences for almost all platforms and technologies. I've written 14 or 15 or 16, or edited rather, published books, and about, I think this is really 250 articles, not 350. I'm sorry, an intern just counted them and found that there were only 253. We have created 10 machine projects combining information design with persuasion design, in part related to B.J. Fogg's theories of persuasion here at Stanford. And I've been involved in China for several years with the Ditao Academy. We have worked with a lot of corporate large company clients as well as startups. Here are some of the books that I've worked on. The one on the far right is about the Logos visible language system, a set of signs by which you can communicate anything you can in spoken languages, and it was invented by a friend of mine in Japan in the 60s. Mid-year this year, I'll be coming out with my latest book, which is called Mobile Persuasion Design from Springer, and it will have case studies of all of the machine projects. By the way, James, when should we stop? 2. Okay, good. So here are some of the machines, the green machine and the health machine, trying in a mobile app concept design to help change people's behavior using persuasion theory. And we've also done the happiness machine and the marriage machine. In the Tao Academy in Shanghai, I have been working to try to create a center for UX innovation. Mostly I've been giving workshops there. This particular lecture comes from a keynote that I was asked to prepare for the Mensch und Computer conference in Chemnitz, Germany. And from that, I restructured the material for this book, which I can send you. I've presented this lecture in various forums around the world since 2011. I put together a special issue of UX magazine, User Experience magazine, published by User Experience Professionals Association, about science fiction in the future, using attention to science fiction media to think about user experiences. There was one article examining the kind of equipment shown in just Star Trek TV and movie episodes. I've also published a version on this theme in Interactions magazine and also in UX magazine. Now, the objective is to introduce you to some issues and themes trying to understand human-computer interaction or user experience design and works of science fiction media which are in film and television, not the movies. I'm not treating games, anime, etc. The world, once you start looking at it just in this topic area, is so vast and so deep and occurring in many countries of the world that it's really a challenge to put together any kind of survey. And this one is very ad hoc and very eclectic and very personal. You can first ask yourselves, well, who first wrote about science fiction? Some people think some of the stories in some of the holy writings of a number of religions are science fiction. There are descriptions in the Bible, the Torah, the Old Testament, which are pretty science fiction-y. Beings and creatures with four faces, fiery imagery of things moving around in space. But there is a reference to Roger Bacon from hundreds of years ago, in which he speaks about machines flying around with no one steering them, flying machines that can be constructed and beat the air with wings like a bird. That, in fact, as many of you will probably think in your minds, is some of the imagery of Leonardo da Vinci. But that was 200 years later. So this is a very early reference to unusual constructions, devices, and interactions with that equipment. When I grew up as a small child in Omaha, Nebraska, in the middle of the United States, I was amazed by the things that I saw in pulp science fiction magazines like Galaxy and Saturn, Astounding Science Fiction, etc. Sort of a heyday of post-World War II publications. One of the magazines which I have in my personal collection is Science Fiction Plus. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of it or seen this set of images, but it was, I think, a creation by Hugo Gernsback, among others, and featured a lot of stories and especially amazing illustrations of robots, of rocket ships. In general, kind of optimistic post-World War II views of the world of the future with occasional destructions of the universe by alien beings or rebellious robots, but still overall a rather enthusiastic and forward-looking vision. I was much influenced by that, and with my late brother, we designed such things as this space helmet made of cardboard and one light bulb and a toilet paper tube. And I actually designed and built a rocket ship control panel by which we could, in our imaginations from our basement, fly off to other planets. So in a sense, I've been an HCI designer since about the age of 12, with limited resources. I also drew pictures of future devices, like this one on the left, as well as rocket ships, space people in suits, guns, ray guns, and so on. And I still have a large part of my collection of science fiction pocketbooks, paperbacks from that time, as well as comic books, which I collected. Now, all of that gradually went through my undergraduate life at Princeton studying physics and math, and then Yale's art school studying graphic design, and through various trips around the world, landed in Berkeley, began teaching at UC Berkeley computer graphics courses. And in 1992, I first got the idea and desire to bring together science fiction writers to come to the Chi conference, which I think met in Monterey, California, if I remember correctly. I invited Bruce Sterling, if you know him, a very funny and clever guy, Werner Vinge, who used to teach in UC San Diego, I believe, and several other people. And in 1999, Kai, remembering the popularity of that event, invited me by itself to hold it again in Pittsburgh in the '99 conference. In fact, I tried to get my brain's forgetting, but the author of Cryptomnicon, if you know the author, Neil Stevenson, to join us, but he couldn't, he said, because he was on a book tour. And as it turned out, he was in Pittsburgh that very day talking about his book when we had our opening panel at Kai. And for that occasion, I invited all of the authors and myself to wear funny hats, so we would be sort of aliens within the computer science and cognitive science community. That was well received. And I've been wearing this hat ever since, not every day, but on lecture occasions. Bruce Sterling, in his original presentation at Kai, I think in '92, when asked to describe computers of the future, reached into his pocket and said, in the future, this is what computer technology will look like. You can fold it, it's flexible, it has threads embedded in it as a battery. You can place it over something and copy that. You can see anything you want with it. You can even blow your nose in it if you want. And after you're done, put it back in your pocket. There is a way to create a taxonomy of human-computer interaction. Many people have attempted that. And there are these kinds of issues that I show you here that could be considered in trying to categorize all the phenomena, all the aspects of development, especially in relation to metaphors, mental models, navigation, interaction, and appearance. Likewise, in the science fiction world, there is a taxonomy of sci-fi. People have proposed a variety of ways of categorizing all of these in terms of the story arcs, the genres, the particular technology used, the view of society and culture, particular hardware and software emphases, the approach to time, whether it's steampunk science fiction that mixes a little bit of 19th century technology with the worlds of the future and so on. Imagine, if you will, that you take these two taxonomies and cross them. You now have hundreds of opportunities for PhD theses to look at how particular aspects from the HCI world are thought about or developed in the various media of science fiction as they have evolved over the past 5 or 6 or even 10 decades. This particular presentation, as I mentioned, is somewhat limited and constrained. I'm really just going to show you some examples from movies, for the most part, and a few TV shows, to think about how you could think about HCI or UX in science fiction media. Verbal literature, how many of you are sci-fi fans? A fair number. You know and have noticed that in verbal literature, the authors can describe the inner thoughts of people much more easily than you can get access to them in most films and television programs. And they can choose to describe some aspects of the physical scene, kinds of interaction, details, etc. But in movies, you have to show something. Otherwise, you have a blank back screen or a green screen. And that won't be very much of interest to people. So it has been a challenge for movies and TV. They have to show something. As you look at the examples that I'm going to show you, you can think about what are the assumptions about who's using this equipment or these pieces of hardware or software? What sort of control panels are depicted? What sort of cultural diversity of the user community is exhibited? Are there particular focuses on certain hardware? Why? Any information visualization techniques that we should note? Any emphasis on speech or audio versus visual or haptic displays? Do these films seem to indicate any user-centered design at all in what they're showing? They didn't actually have to undergo that process in producing the kinds of things that they're showing. They're not producing products and services for a real commercial market. Those are just some of the aspects that you might think about. Or think about these particular themes. What in this movie or TV show does in fact seem futuristic? Or is there a reference somehow to the present or past? Are there any gender role issues that emerge? What roles do men and women play in these stories and with the equipment? Are the views positive about technology or neutral or negative? Is the technology threatening, dangerous, fearsome, or beneficial and optimistic and good for humanity? Are there any kinds of culture issues that emerge? Because for the most part, these films have grown out of Europe and North America. Not China, not India, not the Middle East, not Africa. Are there any sorts of culture or social biases built in? I'm going to begin with a few historical examples, that is, older history. Some of you may not know all of these. Some of you may know some of them. How many of you have seen Metropolis from 1927? A few. Most of this is available on YouTube or somewhere on the web, and often in your local movie theater. The earliest science fiction films, as such, were created in France at the end of the 19th century. Sort of the first science fiction movie was just a kind of technology gag in which a pig was fed into a machine and out came sausage and other pork products at the other end. And that was very amusing and astonishing to the people looking at some of the first movies ever made in 1895. A number of these early films were made by the Méliès brothers in Paris. And in fact, their work was given a tribute in a recent film. Let's see, what was it? Hugo? To show the work of these early science fiction filmmakers. Some of you may have seen A Trip to the Moon, in which a rocket ship lands in an image of the moon with some human face that's quite annoyed at getting poked by a rocket ship, or 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. These were some of the first attempts to show outlandish or unusual flying machines, circumstances of movement, and high technology. Here are some scenes from Fritz Lang's Metropolis, the most expensive silent movie ever made. I have just watched recently a blended copy made from original film of the complete movie. Sometimes incomplete versions are shown. It's quite interesting to see it. For one thing, the first robots appear. It happens to be a female robot, an evil female robot.
What do they call it? I mean, it predates the term robot.
Yes. Well, I think, as you see here, a machine. That's a good point. And this is a movie which is a social-political story of capitalists trying to control production. It's a heartwarming romance between a man and a woman. Marie is the woman who's modeled in this robot by the magnate, and the hero is the son of this very rich, powerful man. Some of the control devices which are shown in this future society are nothing more than late 19th century dials and gauges and knobs, although there is on the rich owner of production in society at the time, a kind of telephone connection board with which he can communicate with people all around the city or the building or the society, perhaps. And his desk is unusually empty of paper and other items. One of the other important distinctions in this movie is that a video phone or a picture phone kind of a connection is depicted. This is 20 years before television, commercial television. So it's really quite impressive to see this displayed. He communicates, in fact, with this chief engineer who's instructed to carry out his orders. So there are a number of very important fundamental kinds of technologies that are displayed. In fact, as some people are now beginning to do, some researchers in HCI or MMI are just studying the theme of robots in science fiction movies in comparison to the actual performance and characteristics of automatons and robots as they have been developed over the past 50 or more years. There are, I think, important distinctions in how film creators created them and described them and showed them, how audiences reacted to them, and the actual constructs in industrial robots and other circumstances. Another example of flat screen displays was in the 1930s in Flash Gordon movies, if some of you have seen those. This particular one comes from about 1936 and is not much different than what you can buy today from Samsung or what was depicted in 1968 in the movie 2001. People look at it, address it, communicate with others. There isn't too much discussion or anything shown of control devices and details of interacting with it in general. Another early depiction of robots were these flying machines, which were actually kind of a form of drones that appear in 1941 in Mechanical Monsters, a particular Superman animation. Usually I'm not showing animations, but this is an interesting one because it was used as an inspiration in Sky Captain in the World of Tomorrow. I don't know if any of you have seen that one, but it was one of the first movies to be created on a PC. And a lot of the shooting was with real actors and a green screen, and then all of the other equipment and scenes were produced by the, I guess, director artist. I doubt if any of you know about or have seen Captain Video. Anyone? You'd have to be as old as I am to know about this. But in the 1950s, this was one of several popular TV science fiction program serials that appeared I suppose every week. The sets were primitive, probably not too much fancier than my cardboard and light bulb space helmet. In fact, at one point, when Captain Video with his co-pilot was in the rocket ship control room flying around the universe, his assistant bumped into the control panel, and the entire thing fell over because it was just a piece of cardboard and some paper gauges. He, somewhat embarrassed, lifted it up, pushed it back against the fake wall of the rocket ship that we could see on the television screen. This was before there were videotapes to catch and delete such scenes, and had to say to Captain Video, "Oh, good thing no wires were broken." And they continued with the previous script dialogue. Another one was Tom Corbett and his Space Cadets. Most of those programs, and certainly movies into a decade later, like Journey to the Center of Time, almost inevitably exhibited the equipment that was supposed to suggest high technology. This often included whirling magnetic discs, tape discs, many rows of blinking light bulbs. I had some of those on my rocket ship control panel myself. And of course, scientists in white jackets and ties. Why this person would be in a regular business suit flying to the center of Earth, I don't remember, but is very suspicious. That imagery was so well known and so often used that it was used as kind of a gag for the Mensch und Computer conference that invited me in 2011. And here are the equivalent of the IBM 360 mainframes, men and women in white shirts. Men had ties. Women often in the background doing unknown tasks of clerical or administrative nature, whirling magnetic tapes, and blinking lights. That gender role distinction continues in some science fiction, as elsewhere in the world. Here's Voyage to the Planet of Prehistoric Women from 1968, a low-budget film that I'm sure you've never seen, featuring men in very complex and heavily protected suits, flying in their flying machines to a distant planet that's inhabited only by women, who amazingly don't need any of this kind of equipment. In fact, they don't seem to need very much clothing, for that matter, and are able to communicate telepathically. That's important. Keep that in mind when we come to Avatar, many decades later. As you can see from this scene, it's filled with men in white jackets in front of large wall displays of twirling tapes and blinking lights. This theme of men with machines, and often with armor and arms, versus the gentler females is a theme that has continued. Let's look at some more recent examples, but again, think about those issues and the themes that I mentioned before. If you have any comments, if you've seen some of these movies and have a certain reaction or memory of them, I'll be happy to hear that. I'm sure many of you know this scene immediately. The Star Wars series, created by George Lucas and his colleagues, was momentous in many ways. For one thing, the rocket ships were dirty. The machinery was rusty and decrepit. In the movies of the past, all of the technology was almost always gleaming, clean, brand new, infallible. This stuff failed sometimes was broken. He also introduced charming robots, CPO, R2-D2. There wasn't so much HCI innovation, to tell you the truth, as far as I feel looking at it. He did have a little mind control of objects. He did have some fancy blinking lights on Darth Vader's chest piece. But for the most part, the scenes in rocket ships fighting space battles, which were based, as you may know, on George Lucas and his friends looking carefully at World War II aircraft fighter war film to capture the battle scenes. Much of that was like then current cockpits or even previous generations. He did introduce the lightsaber, which was a variation on swordplay from centuries earlier. His mastery was in story arcs, in mythological storytelling, and the creation of admittedly very memorable characters. So that certainly is not to detract from his achievements. It just wasn't seemingly his special interest to create charming, new, or advanced HCI technology.
In a holographic project.
Excuse me, yes, he did have, what's her name? Princess Leia with the earmuffs projected as a holographic image. So that should be mentioned also as one of the technology items that's worth mentioning. Yeah. Actually, in the Terminator series, you see some more technology innovation, certainly like robot vision and augmented, thank you, HCI depictions, which are impressive. Star Trek series, supposedly taking place in 2366 and beyond, created by Gene Roddenberry, had a lot of technology which they introduced almost all the time. There were many devices. There were scenes of people interacting with them. Some of them were so well known, like the voice communicator, that they were even parodied in other movies like Galaxy Quest, if you happen to know that lovely film. There was another achievement about the use of the technology, which was a multi-gender, in fact, a alien and human crew. Admittedly, most of the aliens looked more or less like human beings with strange masks on, but they were intended to be of different races, different genders, and different species, earthly and extraterrestrial, all using this equipment. And that was something of interest, I think, and is noteworthy about it. In a more recent release of a Star Trek movie in 2013, the director, J.J. Abrams, introduces wonderful scenes like this one, where someone, I think, is supposed to be getting medical treatment or repair of his wounds or something. I can't quite recall. And you can see in the background, there's lots of screens, lots of depictions of complex scientific displays, human-computer interaction. Unfortunately, we never get close. You never get to see exactly what's going on, which is sort of a pity. There are transparent displays, so some of the information is being shown backwards, which is a modern theme of a lot of science fiction movies. And of course, there is the occasion of a half-naked woman who suddenly has to be shown somewhere in the storyline. I forget why she takes her clothes off. I'm sure there was a good reason. Most of this is eclipsed by many explosions, action movie sequences, etc., which unfortunately I think have taken over for chances to show details of human-computer interaction or even the storyline and character development of the stories. Same thing happened in the game when it rebooted in 2013. Most of it is warrior-focused and not HCI focused. Here's another famous scene from a movie which undoubtedly you know. 2001, the famous moment when Hal, the computer running the show, reads the lips of the two astronauts and learns that they're plotting to kill Hal, turn him off. 2001 was a blockbuster in many ways. It was a creative depiction of advanced technology, combining the minds and interests of Stanley Kubrick, along with Arthur C. Clarke, the author of the original novel. It contained many innovations, like the fact that space is quiet. There are no sounds of rocket ships flying through space, as there were in previous movies, because there's no air to carry the sound. They were attempting to envision technology 40 years later, or 30 years later. They did get some things right, and they got some things magnificently wrong. There were no mobile phones in the world of 2001, as they thought about it. They didn't imagine that that would come about. People instead were using advanced payphone depictions, sort of, in order to communicate through AT&T. There are a lot of corporate sponsors. Many of the sponsors mentioned at the time, not sponsors, but brands mentioned at the time, no longer even exist. There was also, I think, one of the first HCI jokes ever introduced into film. In this particular scene, one of the astronauts needs to use the bathroom. But the first thing he has to do is to read the instruction manual for how to operate the bathroom. It's quite long. One imagines that he never did make it in time to the bathroom. Here's an executive meeting that takes place, I think, on the moon near the site where they've discovered the rectangular slab. There are no PCs, no mobile phones sitting on the desks. It's kind of a vintage 1950s, 60s, 70s paper-filled office, but clean and neat. And that in itself is interesting. There are a lot of scientific displays, information visualization, which appear throughout the movie at different times. Not too much of it is exceedingly advanced or unusually well designed. It is workmanlike, I guess I would say, and very typical of the times. But at least it is appearing there, and there are scenes of multi-screen displays that appear, which also are given a fair amount of time so that one can both contemplate the advanced technology and actually think about what they might be showing. Here's another such scene of two of the astronauts looking at this large screen display with multiple depictions of information. Some of the other displays look like CAD/CAM drawings of the time in about late 1960s and early 70s. Inside of I think a little tiny escape vessel, if I recall correctly, Or this is the one that he goes outside maybe to rescue one of his partners. The displays are somewhat advanced, but nothing to write home about. There is possibly a flat display lying on top of a table, or else it's built into the table in order to give the person information while they're eating one of their space meals. Television communication or video communication is shown realistically because of the tremendous time delays between messages. So in some ways, they try to be scientifically accurate. They try to give a fair amount of attention to details of HCI display and show how people would interact with that equipment. Here's another fairly iconic image, which some of you will know. This is actually from Tron 2, Tron Legacy. When it first came out in 1982, and I've just watched recently on television the original Tron again, it was somewhat innovative at the time because it tried to show, to depict, to visualize a world of software, operating systems, code. In that sense, it was something that had never been done before. In the replay done in 2010, a lot of the attention was focused on, well, beautiful costumes and lots of motorcycle-like action. It was sort of an adventure game. It did have lightsabers of one kind or another. A lot of the equipment focused on this circular disk of memory and power that one held on one's back. And whenever user interfaces per se were shown, they were either as the old video games being depicted from the 60s, or something like the Unix operating system being shown in code on screens, which was kind of a charming throwback. Any other comments about Tron from your own experience? Have you seen it?
There might be something to talk about on Tron because there's a shift, at least in the first one, from talking about robots and do robots have a personality to essentially talking about programs.
And whether programs have yes, that's a good point. This is a software movie, not a hardware movie. That's a good point. Please feel free to throw in comments if you have them. This next scene may not be so well known to you. It's one of my favorite movies. Yes. Brazil, Terry Gilliam, who has created many weird and strange movies, delightful in their detailed backgrounds of things going on. This was, if not steampunk, it was a strange combination of not 18th century, but late 19th, early 21st century dystopian concoctions of machinery. There were video displays in all the offices, but they were very small black and white sets in which a lens or something was placed in front to magnify the image so that people would have the impression of a larger screen. Telephones had numerous buttons and wires hanging off of them, as did all of the interiors of living quarters, and what was behind the panels was just a gigantic spaghetti mess of tubes and ducts, on purpose to show a kind of society that is sort of just was being held together with Band-Aids. Here's an intrusive little robot camera inspecting a visitor to the Ministry of Information, I suppose it was. Here's a little exoskeleton of a typist busily typing away. What is she typing? There's a close-up of the text that she's typing. She's typing the transliteration of the screams of people being tortured in the next room. That's her job. And here's the hero, just before he eventually succumbs and goes crazy, with some kind of headset in a large anechoic chamber of some kind where he's being tortured and or inspected. It's not a very positive view of technology. A society that has succumbed to the complexities of this technology to the extent that people go out to restaurants where routinely, I suppose, terrorists bomb part of the restaurant in the background, and the waiters quickly bring a screen over so that those who are still left living can continue with their meal and not be disturbed by the gore and destruction just on the other side. Unfortunately, it has kind of echoes of some aspects of life today in some places. Nevertheless, it was a beautifully constructed and kind of heartwarming tale of the young man's fantasy romance with this woman on the left of his dreams. And here's a memorable interaction of equipment and human beings that some of you may recall. This is Arnold Schwarzenegger removing a sensor from his left nostril, which had been detecting his movements. I really don't know how they managed to do this scene. I don't even want to think about it. But Total Recall by Paul Verhoeven, basing his movie on just a short story from P.K. Dick, created a lot of memorable HCI moments. There were scenes of large wall-sized X-ray viewing of passengers coming through security or travelers coming through security. There were scenes of simulated environments being depicted on large screens at home so that even if you didn't have any windows, you could just put up a couple of screens and look outdoors to some environment somewhere in the world that was quite pleasant. There were body suits and body heads or artificial heads that could be strapped in place to disguise one's identity. There were depictions of large, brutal, gray, metallic equipment that was used to remove memories and add new memories into people's lives. Also in this film, there was an example of HCI humor, which I assume was intended. This is a future world, very advanced. People are flying to Mars and back and so on. And the hero, whose name I can't remember right now, checks into a hotel, an advanced hotel. But notice this screen. This is a text screen from the early 1980s. Not likely to be in an advanced hotel like this with such a screen, but I guess the director decided he would have a little joke privately with himself or with the audience.
That exercise thing that they had in there was kind of interesting.
Oh yes. A virtual athletic exercise partner. That was another one of the scenes, thank you, James, that showed high technology in use by consumers, not rocket ship pilots. And that's an important aspect which you can track in many of these films, because most of them spend a lot of time in rocket ships, using specialized equipment for specialized users or operators. Here's another sort of consumer technology innovation, which was that phones were embedded actually with some equipment right into the hand, and you could see screens and displays by simply placing them on a glass surface. In fact, it's a bit of a bother because this fellow needs to perform surgery on his wrist in order to pull out that equipment, which is a little bit gory. but was innovative in terms of handheld devices. Here's another iconic image from the Matrix trilogy by the Wachowski brothers, featuring this kind of falling type display. It was an image like the twirling magnetic disks and blinking lights of past decades, or the transparent displays to suggest high technology. It's also the case that, they added a number of innovations, like using small pills to, like Alice in Wonderland, to make you bigger and smaller, to put you into mental states where you could then participate in the mass fantasy world that had been created by the machines, which had really taken over the world. Most of the scenes, as you can see from these 5 small images, were often dark, black, gray, blue, with occasional scenes of almost emptiness to suggest a very powerful contrast of attempts to kind of clean up this world of illusion. Notice this scene of this one operator in front of a dozen displays in the background. What's odd about it is that I think no human being could actually read any of those displays from that distance. They were simply there to suggest all-powerful technology being monitored. Did you have a question? Or
like one of the operators, he has this sort of he doesn't read the individual characters anymore. All I see is red woman and weather or
It was Cyberpunk, yeah.
yeah, Cyber.
Well, there are actually occasions, in fact you can see it here, when they are looking closely at some of the screens. And at the same time, you could imagine that there would be someone who would be looking for just patterns of change from a distance. But still, I think there's the suggestion that there's detailed information here which any user-centered design could not possibly work too well. In fact, compare this scene with an actual high-density display from Bloomberg of 6 intense displays of financial information that were shown at a CHI conference about 2 years ago, I think, and are featured in the UX book. This notion of gigantic displays of information has continued as a theme in movies because you see it in Oblivion from 2013, if you have seen that movie. This probably may be the largest tapestry of information I've ever seen displayed in the movies. Maybe someone knows of a larger one. I'll comment more about that in a moment. And by the way, we were talking at lunch of someone reconstructing some dashboard, or James, do you remember what we were talking about for just a moment? But this is someone who's attempted to construct the Tron dashboard that was shown and to make it work in some way. And that, of course, is a theme which you could carry on in a number of experiments or projects, which is to actually try to make some of the dashboards work that have been depicted over the decades, almost over a century in science fiction movies. Now, here is a scene. I'll be interested to see if anyone knows this one.
Cronenberg movie eXistenz.
Very good. We have a sci-fi movie expert here. This has got to be one of the weirdest science fiction movies you may eventually see because it features biotechnology, flesh-like technology in ways which you have never seen in almost every other movie depiction. It's a world about video games. In fact, embedded 3 deep, if I recall correctly, in layers of video game within video game within video game. Much of it features biomorphic technology that looks like skin and flesh, because it is, in theory, skin and flesh, constructed out of meat, which they grow in laboratories to contain all the necessary apparatus. There is, like in Matrix and like not Gibbons, proposed in the first cyberpunk science fiction, direct connection to the spinal column. In fact, there are scenes of drilling the holes and pushing little things into the hole in order to get stuff into the nervous system. One of the more memorable moments of technology is when the hero, I believe, is having a meal at a restaurant, is served some food, notices the bones and some teeth of whatever he was eating left on the plate, picks up some of the pieces, starts to move them around, pushes some of the bone things together, and creates a pistol, puts in some of the teeth, and shoots and kills the waiter. Highly unusual. There are also moments of humor when, a sort of humor or sarcastic or comical notes when a catalog for body parts is shown, and you can, if you stop the movie, you can read what they created for what you could order for your own body or game. Here in the laboratory, this is bloody technology that they're putting together. Here's one particular scene when they're pushing, I forget what the purpose of this little blobby Play-Doh-like thing was that they're pushing into the central nervous system, but they do. Here he's assembling his pistol. You play with biomorphic command and control devices. There is a headpiece that people put on to, I believe, get connected into the games or levels of the game world. So this has quite a lot of creative technology, much of it quite different from anything that you've seen in Star Wars or Captain Video or any of the other movies. Let's take a look again at these themes. Think again about what we've shown. We consider more recent movies like Minority Report. This again is a P.K. Dick short story turned into a movie. He was a incredibly powerful, or has had an incredibly powerful influence in his short stories. Steven Spielberg took this, put Tom Cruise in it, and had Tom wave his hands. And thus was born all of the PR and interest in hand gestures for human-computer interaction, which was good in some ways, although not very practical from a human factors point of view, exceedingly tiring if you had to do that for more than a few minutes. But they did show virtual avatars, a lot of transparent displays that you could see backwards, a lot of advanced technology. Most of the hand-waving was just to seemingly move photos around and not very complex interactions at that, but very influential, let's say, in discussions of HCI. And it wasn't long before Samsung and others were showing, in fact, such transparent displays as these, where you could look into the room next door or anything else that you wanted to depict. If you wanted privacy, you could lower virtual blinds or have scenes appear as necessary in the displays. Here's another scene from a movie which possibly you've viewed. If you don't have enough hands to carry out the task, you can simply graft on 2 more to the bottom of your feet. or your legs rather, as this person does in the movie. Does anyone know the movie? Thank you. Shown again not too recently, or quite recently on TV, about a post-virus world after 2011, by a woman director, one of the few women directors of these films. It features a number of HCI innovations like passing information through a little capsule or pill that's passed from one mouth to another because they don't want anyone else to capture the information. Skin displays, you flick your hands on your forearm and suddenly a map is depicted to guide you through a building. One of the heroine's eyeballs is replaced by a camera, which she kind of rolls into place by tipping back her head. She goes into a dream state to contact headquarters and others of her secret group. One other charming device created was a set of rolling drones, I guess you could call them. They're not flying, but they're little marble things that she carries with her, throws on the floor. They run off and inspect the environment, I guess report back to her, or can assemble, as they do in the movie, in order to explode and knock out part of a wall. What was charming about it is that she calls them to attention by whistling for them. And they all hear her and come to her rescue or attention. Here's an information visualization display, which you may know or remember from, probably wouldn't remember it, Ultraviolet, which you may have seen. This is a guide to moving around in the building. There are transparent displays. There are paper phones, which are used once and thrown away from a vending machine, I think. Interestingly, this world of the not too distant future of 2078 has writing which we can no longer read very easily. In a surviving core of humanity following some worldwide disease or plague, if I recall correctly. But it's interesting that the writing system at the time has so changed in let's say 60 years that we can no longer read this text. Maybe you know this one. This is a science fiction comedy.
Going to the future where everybody's stupid. Idiocracy. Yeah.
Thank you. Idiocracy by Mike Judge. I guess we could expect that of him. This is an enormously funny and depressing view of the future in which everyone, through poor education, for the most part, except, of course, currently people here, has so dumbed down society that an ordinary guy in the army who's put into a state of suspended animation along with a prostitute and forgotten for 500 years finally wakes up and discovers he is the smartest man on earth because everyone else is so uneducated, simply stupid. The President of the United States, depicted here, controls the Congress with an automatic rifle at meetings. Most of the large screen displays are basically sex and stupidity comedy. No one can spell anymore, so even a medical assistant in a hospital has to use little pictograms to try to diagnose what might be wrong with the hero when he comes to complain about something, and all the newscasters are naked on the evening news. Avatar, you probably know quite well, from James Cameron. This is, again, a clash of men and machines against gentler folks, somewhat matriarchal in nature. Certainly, the women can communicate with each other, with animals, with trees, with the central tree of feeling and knowledge. And it's a battle to the death. Assisted by these transparent screens. This is Ratava, which is Avatar spelled backwards because we see it on the screen backwards, looking through the screen. Now, this particular technique of display has a long history. Leonardo da Vinci, in painting the Last Supper, an image springs to your mind if you've studied it in art history. It's a long table with the apostles at the side and Jesus in the center. That isn't the way banquets took place at the time that it's supposed to be. They were U-shaped tables. But Leonardo, faced with a room in which he had to depict all this and the scene that he wanted to show, broke apart the standard way in which people ate, put them all in a straight line. Why? Because we could all now see their faces, which was very useful for his storytelling. Same thing here. The camera can look right through these screens. You can see the emotions of the actors. We're running out of time, so I'll quickly sum up. Here's District 9, which depicts space aliens over Johannesburg, South Africa. There are scenes in here, if you ever go to see it, please do. There's about a 3-minute depiction of hand manipulation by an alien, which is 10 times more beautiful and complex than anything that Tom Cruise did in Minority Report. It's a wonderful depiction of human-computer interaction techniques. You may know this one, Prometheus, by Ridley Scott, who just produced Exodus, Gods and Kings. In this case, he wanted to use real equipment and not a lot of CGI. He has controls which are bulbousy and weird looking, as probably they would be from an alien civilization if we were to find them. Amazingly, this human-sized android fits into the seats, is able to read the writing and to manipulate the controls. They also show three-dimensional depictions of sort of like drone cameras discovering what the layout of this special space is that they've discovered, and lots of essentially blue screen displays. Oblivion by Joseph Kosinski has a fair amount of HCI depictions, which I urge you to take a look at. Wraparound displays. Pacific Rim has followed a theme in current movies of trying to decorate the human body with exoskeletons, and there are quite a number of lovely scenes of these. Amazing computer graphics, some of it quite fantastical and hard to believe could show anything useful and information, along with flying numbers that go up and down the screen for no apparent reason. Battlestar Galactica is a US television series redesigned from the original. Lots of the screens look more typical of the past. Edge of Tomorrow with Tom Cruise again. Exoskeletons inspired by a Japanese graphic novel. It's not only Hollywood that has produced interesting and strange displays of future technology. Some of you may know that Apple did in the Knowledge Navigator from 1992, depicting a foldable display, picture of Steve Jobs, a caricature, and natural language technology that many people poo-pooed, saying this couldn't be accomplished for 20 years. And it's true. It took 20 years to create Siri, which now operates. AT&T did the same thing. The Department of Defense created augmented cognition and had headsets which could sense when the brain was being overloaded in a particular channel and change the medium of display. Most of what I've shown you has come from Europe and North America, but India, China, and Japan have also produced science fiction. You can go to, if nothing else, websites to list all of this from Wikipedia. I don't have images of any of these. China has done the same thing. Here's one of the first major science fiction movies in China, Death Ray on Coral Island from 1980, with people in white coats and typical clean displays of a generation earlier. There are some new science fiction authors coming about, like this one, creating the three-body problem, which I think will find its way into films. If you're talking just about Japanese science fiction, oh my goodness, is there a lot to choose from. I don't have time to even begin to show you examples. So some closing thoughts. These HCI movies are ways to think about doing personas and use scenarios. You can do studies of what people seem to find acceptable, useful, and interesting. You can use them as a gauge of what people thought was acceptable or understandable in terms of future technology. There's a lot to look at. I hope you will be inspired to look further. Thank you for your time. Sorry, we've run out officially of time for questions, I take it. People have to go. If you want to ask a question, send me an email. And thank you for your address here.